Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Creedal Catholic. Creedal Catholic is a Catholic theology and apologetics podcast that is faithful to the magisterium and dedicated to the mission of the new evangelization. We're a part of the Vernacular podcast network, and if you'd like to support us or find out more about the other shows on our network, head to patreon.com/VPN or vernacularpodcast.com. Patreon.com/VPN or vernacularpodcast.com. Enjoy the show. All right, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Creedal Catholic. I'm joined across the table from me by the resident Cradle Catholic. That's Kevin Boschman. Kevin, hello.
Hello. So, I was actually going to bring that up. That's an interesting point because if I'm not mistaken, Creedal Catholic is a slight play on Cradle Catholic.
That is correct, yes.
So really, this is my podcast.
What?
You just called me the resident Cradle Catholic.
Right, Cradle Catholic.
Right.
We're both Creedal Catholics.
Okay, well, We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Well, hello. Welcome back to Creedal Catholic.
Yes, thank you.
We're going to talk today about this article in First Things, and the article is called How Catholicism Made Me Protestant. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that article. That is an article in the October issue of 2000, or the October issue of First Things. We're not totally sure how that article got in there.
Right. You think, it's a periodical of pretty high, rigorous theological quality, and it's just such a strange opinion piece to have leading. Because we talked about it a little bit, but it doesn't really read much like an actual theological argument.
It's not one.
It's kind of like a memorial to one's sort of faith journey,
self-exploration.
And I think we talked about it a little bit, but it comes across, and maybe it's a little bit harsh to judge it this way, but just because of there's probably a word count, and I only had so much time, so you can't really recount all the nuances. But it reads a lot like a listing of I read this and I read this and I read this, and these things started to contradict each other, and rather than kind of being able to think through it all myself, I just
because there are contradictions among the fathers. The only thing I can do is throw up my hands and be a Protestant.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
And then the end of it I thought was interesting too, because he basically came back to falling on Luther's erroneous interpretation of how the church teaches justification, and decided that was why he was going to be Protestant.
Right,
so
pretty conclusive.
It's pretty clear this person doesn't understand. I wish him all the best, and I say this in all charity, and I hope he comes into the church eventually, but it's pretty clear he doesn't understand the soteriology at work in the church's teaching.
Right, and I'm not too familiar with the author and spyline on a Camel. And you're a little bit familiar with the periodical that he edits, though, right?
Yes, I am.
Davenant Press.
Yeah.
And what's the background of that?
So the Davenant Institute is run by a guy named Bradford Littlejohn, who is a well-intentioned man by all external accounts. I don't know him personally. I know people who do know him personally. I've heard that he's nice and charitable, and I think that most of his writing comes across that way, but the Davenant Institute does a lot of work trying to prevent people from becoming Catholic, and they describe it as ressourcement for the Protestant tradition, so they do dig historically deep into at least as far back as the Reformers, and they do look at the writings of the Church Fathers a little bit, but it's really a lot of the Reformers with a special emphasis on Richard Hooker and Peter Martyr Vermigli and John Calvin, especially Vermigli and Hooker. And so Brad Littlejohn and Chris Cataldo and this guy, Ansi Kamel, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, they do a lot of writing on why they're not Catholic and why no one should be Catholic and why Protestants are right. So it's not surprising that he would write this piece about how Catholicism may be Protestant, but I think throughout he makes a few elementary mistakes in reaching the conclusions that he does. And like I said, I wish him well, and hopefully he'll find his way back to the church at some point.
Sure. I think, what's interesting about an article like this, and maybe moving past kind of who the author is and any sort of personal disposition the author might have, but something that I think is actually valuable in reading something like this is it does give you an idea of where we, I think, as Catholics are responsible for training ourselves and identifying some of the areas maybe of misunderstanding that people of this particular theological or thought bent are looking. And one that was really interesting to me, a line that he writes here, and it's almost flippant. And I'd actually be interested in kind of seeing what really goes behind this. But he's talking about some of his, he went through early kind of theological development, read a lot of Catholic Church documents, and then he talks about some of the debates that he got into, and I'll just quote straight from the article. He says, on one occasion, a Reformed professor dispensed with my arguments for transubstantiation in a matter of minutes.
Yeah,
and I found that really interesting.
That was very interesting.
We talked a couple episodes ago and our episode about the real presence, about some of the very strong arguments for transubstantiation. And it makes me wonder, what's behind that sentence? Which arguments is he specifically talking about? It'd be interesting to know, but, even if we never get to that answer, I think it really illustrates the importance of understanding for us the grounding, the theological grounding of these different doctrines of the faith. And it provides us with the ammunition then when we encounter an article like this to be able to read it with maybe some more dispassionate kind of a lens, and to be able to find areas where we can, if you start to have a reaction to certain lines in this article, maybe it helps you identify some deficiencies in your own understanding of the faith in areas where rather than running away from the faith, maybe you can run towards it and identify ways to strengthen your understanding of the doctrine of the church.
Well said. All right, today we're going to, first of all, try to keep this a little bit shorter. Kevin, before we were recording, was telling me that I was, what were your words, extraordinarily long-winded at times?
No, never.
I think that's what you said. I'm sorry, I just get so excited about this stuff. But we're going to try to do 30 to 45 minutes. And our topic today is from the October issue of First Things, and it's a long article by George Weigel. Now, George Weigel, if you've probably heard of him if you're listening to this podcast, but he is a Catholic writer. He's written a lot of great things, several gigantic books, including the, I would say probably the best biography of John Paul II. And he is, or was, a close friend of the former pontiff, Pope St. John Paul II. So he has a very interesting perspective on what he writes about here. And the title of this piece is The Catholic Moment. And the subtitle or the description is George Weigel puts today's crisis in historical context, pointing a way forward. And let me just read you the lead of this piece, and then that'll, I think, open it up for discussion here. Weigel says, the current crisis in the global church is not the worst crisis in Catholic history, but it is bad enough. Nor is it confined to the scandals of clerical sexual abuse and malfeasant church leadership, though those scandals crystallize its meaning and implications. Today's crisis must be properly located in its distinct historical context, not to excuse, minimize, or mitigate, but in order to understand and know how to respond. Today's crisis is best understood and the remedies for it best conceived in light of the great ecclesiastical drama of the past 250 years, the drama of Catholicism and modernity. So right there, he's setting up the key to understanding the current crisis in the church as this drama between Catholicism and modernity. So, Kevin, what does he mean by this? What crisis in the church? I thought that as soon as I became Catholic, all of my greatest fears were assuaged and everything was perfect. And
we all know that you didn't think that.
Is that not true?
Oh, man. So really, I think that, the crisis that he is specifically talking about, he talks a little bit about some of the scandals of clerical sexual abuse, but really what he's focusing on is what Pope St. John Paul II and what Benedict XVI really brought out in their pontificates about the what did they call it? The tyranny of relativism.
Yes.
Right. So that's really when we talk about modernity and specifically this kind of theological or philosophical modernity, we're talking about the triumph to some degree of what we would term as science, material science, and empirical study over the liberal arts, philosophy, theology, and how that has some very serious consequences for our worldview and had some very serious consequences for the way the church developed, I think, especially when you look at some of, as George Weigel talks about, and we'll get into, kind of from the 19th century through especially the middle to late middle portions of the 20th century is what he's really getting after.
Yeah, so we'll talk about all those 5 acts, as George Weigel puts it, but just
very Shakespearean, right?
5 indeed, acts. Yeah, the drama between Catholicism and modernity. Before we dive into all those acts, though, just to make the crisis a little more concrete, he talks about the sexual abuse scandals and he talks about clericalism, but for him, it's not an issue of clericalism. It's not an issue of homosexuality infiltrating the church. Those things can play a part, but for him, it's about fidelity.
Right.
And because it's about fidelity, that's what is wrapped up in this whole tyranny of relativism idea. So for him, it's about the what has been in the past several dramas or several acts of this drama. It's been about a give and take between Catholicism and modernity, or an inability to adequately engage modernity on the part of the church. So it's a crisis of fidelity. And so you mentioned the sexual abuse stuff. That's what he writes about. He also talks about just how the church has, in some cases, lost her way. Now, obviously, he's not saying that the magisterium has lost her way. It's not that the church's claims to authority are fully moot. But there are certainly bishops who are going astray, or who are at the very best, leading ambiguously and not being good and faithful pastors. So, I mean, this is actually a very pertinent discussion for today as we talk about this on October 7th, because just yesterday the Amazon Synod kicked off, and there are a lot of things that are going to be discussed at the Amazon Synod that have pretty big implications for the wider church. I was looking at the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document for the Amazon Synod, and I was reading more specifically Cardinal Walter Brandmüller, who's now 91 years old. He is obviously a cardinal, but he's no longer a voting cardinal because he's past the age of 80. He's been a church historian his entire career, very learned and brilliant man, and he pinpointed 6 problems with the Instrumentum Laboris, and I'll link to those in the show notes. But there are some serious problems with the way that this is approaching systematic and moral and pastoral theology. I'm going to read you just a little excerpt from this, Kevin, and I want to see if you can understand what in the world the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document for the Synod, is talking about.
Sure, and just to frame it up just a little bit, I think. So the Amazon Synod, for any of our listeners who haven't following kind of what's been happening, it's ultimately a synod that is focused around the idea of how best to catechize, especially in the Amazon, South America, regions where Catholicism doesn't have kind of a historical reach, and especially some of these indigenous South American cultures where Catholicism appears to be in such great odds with the cultural norm of those societies, right?
Yeah, and this is also seen as timely by viewers outside the church, because we had the Amazon is burning, fires all throughout Brazil, adding to pollution in the atmosphere, deforestation, really sort of, not sort of, an ecological disaster in the past few months in the Amazon. And so the church is also very concerned about that, especially under the Francis Pontificate. How do we best care for creation as stewards of God's creation? And so all of these things are wrapped up in the Amazon Synod. So this is certainly an important topic. And the concern from quarters of the church who have expressed concern about the Amazon Synod is not the fact that a synod is happening to figure out how to best reach people with Christ and how to best transpose our Christianity into care for the environment. Those are good things and good questions to ask. It's the ideas that are communicated in the working document, and it's the leadership of the synod itself, who at times in the past have shown, at the very least, questionable theology on certain issues.
Right, and I think it's whenever you start talking about how best to reach a culture that is not necessarily as adaptable or as already in line with a lot of the cultural norms of Catholicism, I think what a lot of the lay faithful kind of start to worry about, or what kind of gives them some nervous anxiety, is the question of, well, is the faith going to be adapted to this? Because that's the idea that the universal church is the holder of truth, and then it seems, at least on some level, at odds with the idea of adaptation. But I think we'll probably get into that. So read away, and we'll see where it takes us.
Yeah, well, we'll
follow the argument, as Socrates would say.
A great segue, because Brandmüller points out one of his 6 complaints being upside down hermeneutics. And he writes, has the Church of Christ been put by her founder as though she was some kind of putty into the hands of bishops and popes, so that they may now, illuminated by the Holy Spirit, rebuild her into an updated instrument with secular goals too? The structure of the text presents a radical U-turn from the hermeneutics of Catholic theology. The relationship between Holy Scripture and apostolic tradition on the one hand and the Church's magisterium on the other has been classically determined in such a way that revelation is fully contained in Holy Scripture and tradition, while it is the task of the magisterium, united with a sense of the faith of the whole people of God, to make authentic and infallible interpretation. Okay, so that's what Brandmüller is saying. And then he cites this portion of the working document that goes so far as to claim that there could be new sources of revelation. So let me read this excerpt from the working document, and you can tell me, Kevin, if this makes any sense at all to you, because it doesn't.
It sounds loaded, but let's go for it.
I read from the working document here. Furthermore, we can say that the Amazon, or another indigenous or communal territory, is not only an ubi, or a where, parentheses, a geographical space, but also a quid, or a what, a place of meaning for faith, or the experience of God in history. Thus, territory is a theological place where faith is lived, and also a particular source of God's revelation. Epiphanic places where the reserve of life and wisdom for the planet is manifest, a life and wisdom that speaks of God. What is that talking about? Not only an ubi or a where, but also a quid or a what.
I don't use this term lightly, and I guess I'll just come out with it and say it sounds almost relativistic.
It does.
And I don't like to use that word because unless I'm pretty confident in it, because it is a word that is pretty at odds with faith, right? I mean, the Catholic faith is not a fan of relativism, but it does sound, if you're starting to define what your experience of the Church Universal and what your experience of the encounter with Christ is as somehow wrapped up in where your physical location is, it's a little bit like geographic determinism. Not exactly. I mean, geographic determinism being the idea
like the revenge of
where
geography.
You are, right, where you are, the geography around you shapes the way your mind works, and as such, we saw, for example, the argument along geographic determinism would say that Islam emerged out of the deserts of Saudi Arabia because it is a religion that is kind of uniquely adapted to mercantilism and open spaces, and then things along those lines. And it sounds a little bit like this in terms of trying to place Catholicism into sort of a geographic deterministic framework, not saying that, you can't be Catholic because you are in a particular geographic place, but that your experience of Catholicism must necessarily be different because of the place you're in. Does it sound like, am I off base on that?
No, I think you're exactly right. But I doubt whether or not every drafter of this document intended for that meaning to come across. This is one of the perils of group drafting processes. This is one of the perils of working documents. You don't get a chance to work out all the kinks.
Yeah, one of my favorite kind of demotivational posters. So those motivational posters are very corporate that go around. You see them on the hallways and whatever.
Perseverance. So there's a guy climbing a cliff.
Yeah, exactly. And then the demotivational versions of those. And I think one of my favorite ones is it's a picture of the motivational poster with like all the hands around in a circle, and it says teamwork. Because none of us is as stupid alone as all of us are together.
It's so perfect, yeah. It's so perfect. Because everyone gets a piece of the pie, and then the whole pie, it's like part blackberry, blueberry, pumpkin, chocolate, quiche. Okay, so I just wanted to use that quote to illustrate kind of some of the silliness, I guess, is how I best characterize it in this Instrumentum Laboris. Now, I'm not overly concerned about this. It's just a working document. There's nothing magisterial about this. None of the conclusions eventually will necessarily reach any sort of final synod conclusions, and even those would not have magisterial authority in the way that a council does, for sure. So this is not. I don't want to alarm listeners. I don't want to say that this is the church is falling apart.
Because there's all kinds of articles out there already in certain circles.
Yeah, I don't want to.
I try to stay away from. I don't
want to name names, but there are quite a number of Catholic interlocutors who are, crying, not quite schism, but they're almost there based on this stuff. And so I just want to illustrate that there is a Catholic moment here that George Weigel is talking about. There is a crisis. This is not really any different from last year or the year before. Or the year before that. This is, as Weigel puts it, this is an ongoing act in the drama between Catholicism and modernity. And so I think this is useful for us to talk about now because it helps us understand it, and then it helps us engage, and it helps us explain. And as we carry out our mission as Catholics, fulfilling the new evangelization, which this podcast is trying to do, this contextualization by Weigel, I think, is very helpful and helps us understand what's going on here. So with that, let's talk about these various acts that Weigel talks about. So we're not talking about the whole history of the church. We're really talking about the church's engagement with modernity. And with that, Weigel says the first act was Pius IX. You've probably heard a lot about Pius IX. He was a very strong pope in the 19th century, was very harsh against modernism, and Weigel calls his pontificate the penultimate phase of the Reformation. So think, the Reformation came along, highlighted a lot of things in terms of practice that were going wrong in the church. The Council of Trent was convened, corrected a lot of those errors of praxis. And then one of the sort of unintended side effects of the Reformation was that it actually spurred a missionary impulse in the Counter-Reformation for Catholics to go out and re-evangelize the world. And that's where you get the Jesuit order, for example. Some of the greatest missionaries of the church have come about in the Counter-Reformation period because the church realized it needed to go and fix some of those problems and go save souls. So Pius IX was as Weigel says, the penultimate phase of that. But this is also the beginning of the church's engagement with modernism. And he characterizes it as Pius IX versus Voltaire. Voltaire representing the emblematic of the modernist philosophers, and Pius IX holding the line against them. So lots of missionary zeal, but there's also a demise in the material authority or material wealth of the church. Bear in mind, at this time, Pius IX had the Papal States, and this was basically where the Pope was his own sovereign over much of what is now modern-day Italy. It's no longer that way. It really shouldn't be that way, but that's what was happening in the 19th century. So the Papal States go away, and then Act 2 begins with the election of Leo XIII. Leo XIII is expected to be kind of a maintenance pope. He's an elderly guy when he's elected. I think Weigel says he was going to be an elderly placeholder, but Leo XIII had other ideas, and he goes on this tear and writes encyclical after encyclical. I'm not sure about this, but he's at least one of the most prolific popes ever in terms of number of encyclicals, and he might be number one. So he's written a lot. He started to shape the church's nascent Catholic social teaching in response to modernity. Wrote a lot,
especially in response to the Industrial Revolution,
yes.
Right? So just to put some dates to some of this. So the first act you were talking about, French Revolution-ish, really it's around the time when the great Enlightenment philosophers are kind of writing. You mentioned Voltaire as one. You could also put in von Hegel writing around this same time frame. Immanuel Kant a little bit earlier, but definitely influential on this. And then, Act 2 starting kind of as you mentioned with the election of Pope Leo XIII, which is in 1878. So we're right at the cusp of kind of the Industrial Revolution. And I think that's definitely why we see a lot of that Catholic social teaching kind of emerging, because it's the first time we have kind of an urban labor-based society.
And the church needs to engage with that
Absolutely.
And figure out how to help the faithful live as there's a middle class that's growing, right?
Right.
So yeah, Leo XIII does a lot of different things. It's now called the Leonian Revolution because he gave so much shape to the church's Catholic social teaching. He did a lot to revive biblical scholarship. He declared Anglican orders null and void. So that was sort of what constituted the ecumenical efforts of Leo XIII. And he does a lot to shape the church's engagement with modernity. But it was no longer. I think if I'm understanding Weigel correctly, it was no longer as antagonistic as Pius IX. Pius IX was no to modernity. Leo XIII, I think, was modernity's coming. We need to help the church understand and help the faithful understand modernity.
Yeah, and I think Weigel brings us out, and you mentioned it as well, that a big part of, or kind of material part of this that opened up the opportunity for Leo XIII to engage in that manner was the divestment of the Papal States, right? Because by removing the church from a true large political establishment, it actually freed the church to engage politically in a way that was much more disinterested.
Right.
So then by removing itself from political modernity in some sense, the church was then able to re-engage political modernity, not in a physical sense, but in a intellectual and theological sense.
Right, exactly. And another thing with the sort of the ending of Pius IX as he sort of ended the Counter-Reformation and Leo XIII is there's a decline, I think, in the missionary zeal of the church and a decline in the evangelistic orientation of the church because it does adopt this attitude almost of retrenchment in the face of modernism, right? And we need to dig in our heels and say no to modernism. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you do need to say no to modernism. But Act 3, Weigel characterizes as beginning with John the 23rd's convening of the Second Vatican Council. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about the Second Vatican Council, they talk about the Second Vatican Council in the context of the 60s, the sexual revolution especially. I think this was part of the same zeitgeist that the cultural forces at work in the 60s were also the cultural forces shaping the Second Vatican Council. I think there's probably some truth to that. I think it's more true that the cultural forces of the era played into the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council's documents. But really what I think is interesting is to think about the Second Vatican Council in the wake of World War II and World War I, but World War II especially.
And the Korean War.
Wow. And so we've come through, maybe the most, as far as number of deaths, certainly the most violent 40-year period on earth ever.
Right.
And the church is thinking we need to do something about this, right? And so John the 23rd in the Second Vatican Council reinaugurates that evangelistic, outward-oriented missionary zeal, but perhaps at the expense of accommodating modernity a little bit too much.
I think the reason for that, as you mentioned, that time frame is World War I, World War II, to some degree the Korean War. You can argue an interpretation, and one that I'm sympathetic to, that those were, in a sense, the apex of political modernity.
Mm-hmm.
They were wars fought for a particular visions of social progress. They were wars fought with the full efficiency of mankind from a war material sense.
Nuclear weapons.
The leveraging of the industrial, what came out of the Industrial Revolution into a war-making machine. And what that progress rent for us was a lack of the philosophical ideal of the purpose of man, and rather an ideal of economic efficiency, whether it was in the name of National Socialism or communism, ideas that completely belittled the person and the individual at the expense of the state. And we get quotes like Stalin's about how the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic, and that is the actual intellectual framework that Vatican II is now engaging with and trying to erase from the earth, I think.
Right. And in so doing, they think we're going to reestablish this missionary dynamic of the church.
Right.
But again, perhaps accommodate modernism a little bit too much. So then in Act 4, that's basically Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, who come in and sort of course correct a little bit, if that's an accurate assessment.
Yeah, I think it is.
So Vatican II establishes the missionary impulse. The documents of Vatican II establish that the church needs to be outward oriented like this. But then the risk of that, especially in the post-conciliar era where everyone's evaluating this in the 60s and 70s, makes the church a little bit too accommodated to modernism. So then John Paul II, Benedict have to sort of correct a little bit and correct some of these errors. That's why, for example, John Paul II wrote Veritatis Splendor. We talked about that in our Encyclopedia episode a few weeks ago, where this was written in, 94, Kevin?
Yes.
So aftermath of the Berlin Wall, end of the Soviet Union, democracy wins, Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. And the church says, no, actually, there's more to it than that. It's not just democracy above all else. It's Christ above all else. And we need to point people towards this truth, even if that means that it flies in the face of at least some of modernity.
And I want to highlight this because I think we want to be careful to make sure that we're not falling into the trap of Vatican II bashing. And I think George Weigel highlights this very well. The problem was not what came out of Vatican II and what happened in Vatican II. The problem was the application and the individual interpretation by certain members of the church of what came out of Vatican II. And I'll read from the article just briefly what Weigel kind of talks about this. And he says, in the latter years of the pontificate of Paul VI, a double-edged counterproposal came into play. According to that counterproposal, the church should critically engage cultural, economic, social, and political modernity in public debate about the questions of meaning and value that would decide the human future. It should do so in two ways: through evangelism, which responded to modernity's quest for meaning, and on the basis of its social doctrine, which might provide a more secure foundation for modernity's aspirations to liberty, equality, prosperity, and solidarity. And I think what happened after Vatican II with some of the misplaced application was on that social doctrine side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
That's a good clarification to make. We are not Vatican II bashing because Vatican II is authoritative and it is church teaching, and those documents are dogmatic. So we're not bashing it at all. But what we can criticize, I think, is the way in which those documents are subsequently interpreted by lay Catholics and by clerics, right? And that can have unintended side effects, especially if you're interpreting them in accordance with the spirit of the age, right?
And especially if you're interpreting them without having read them, which is often the case.
That's also very true. Yeah, go ahead and read the Vatican II documents before you claim to be acting in accordance with Vatican II when you are making liturgical revisions, for example.
And you're going to have a great time reading them. They're beautiful.
They are.
They really are.
They really are. Okay, so Act 4, Benedict XVI, Pope St. John Paul II. And then Weigel says we're now in Act 5. And I don't know if I missed it, Kevin, but I didn't find a specific point at which we transitioned from Act 4 to Act 5.
No, I don't think he really called out a stark kind of historical timeline kind of divide the way he does with a lot of the other ones. He kind of frames it more around this the intellectual assault on Catholicism that kind of emerged coming through, especially in Benedict's pontificate, I think.
Right. So clearly the Francis pontificate is in Act 5. He says it's the one in which we're living today. And he also includes in Act 5 the sex abuse crisis, started in 2002 in Boston when the Boston Globe reporters uncovered sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of Boston. Obviously, last year we're still living through this. The Pennsylvania grand jury report, over 300 priests involved. Bishops, high prelates in the church, at best, turning a blind eye to this stuff. At worst, actively covering it up and facilitating it. So these things have really, really marred the church's image. And Weigel said, it is difficult to imagine a more severe counter-witness to the truth of Christ than the abuse of innocent young people by those claiming to speak in Christ's name.
Right, and that's, not to drag us backwards, but I think that really is what he's highlighting as the start of Act 5, is the emergence of these reports, because it does in a lot of ways provide the greatest ammunition for modernity, right? Because you look at this, and as you said, these are defenseless people. You can't really think of a more morally depraved act than to attack or abuse someone who is completely defenseless. And that opened the door in a lot of ways for modernity to have what, for one of the first times, were truly just and reasonable criticisms of the actions of the church, which led to now this kind of modern crisis of now the church has to answer those claims of how its theology and how it can claim to be the moral arbiter for faith and for morals, if then people acting in the name of the church, people ostensibly acting the highest levels in the name of the church, seem to have failed the very people who the church is most responsible for protecting.
Yeah, it's been absolutely devastating. I mean, two quick anecdotes here. Bishop Barron did a Reddit Ask Me Anything at the end of September, and I just popped on there briefly while he was in the middle of it. And at the time, at least, I don't know how it ended up when it was all said and done, but at the time, one of the most upvoted comments was one where the commentator basically said, why should we listen to you when you're a bunch of child abusers? And second, someone close to me who's a Protestant recently said that he would rather be atheist than Catholic because Catholics are a bunch of sexual abusers. So this has really, really damaged the church's witness. And I think it's really impossible to overstate exactly how much it's damaged the church's witness. And it's a mistake to just point to any singular cause as being at root other than fidelity. This is a lack of faithfulness to Christ and his church. That's why this stuff is happening.
And it's such a difficult topic to engage because so many people are so hurt and affected by it, right? And so it's hard, especially once comments like that are made. You could analyze them and view them as ad hominem attacks, which they are. They're not logically consistent. But on the same level, even if you are not going to engage with the ad hominem attack itself, because to do so would be logically fruitless, you still have to engage with the fact of the abuse, and you have to engage with the reality that a lot of people are very deeply hurt and continue to hurt because of this. And the church has a very important role and responsibility to rectify that. And in order for it to reclaim or to claim its moral authority, regardless of the logic of the argumentation, because the church, well, the fullness of logic and truth has so many more elements to it, it does have a responsibility to answer those emotional and kind of personal claims as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's all well and good to say, you're talking about practice, we're talking about doctrine, but doctrine does inform practice, right? And it does address your doctrine if no one's believing it well enough to act in accordance with it. So it really is a serious crisis. And it's not to say that it is a devastating blow that kills the church, because we know the church will not be killed. But it does mean that in this Act 5, it's very important for clerics and lay people alike to respond to this. And Weigel suggests that we respond to this by being what he calls a culture-converting counterculture, offering skeptics a path beyond doubt, relativists a path beyond the will to power, and nihilists a path beyond emptiness. The core of that offer is friendship with Jesus Christ, whom the Catholic Church proclaims as the answer to the question that is every human life. And then he lists these 5 truths that the church also proposes in answer to modernity. So the church does not condemn everything in modernity, but the church offers useful correctives to the many of the ideas behind modernity. so that it can, in his words, put it on firmer foundations. But actually, real quick, before we talk about those 5 truths, I want to mention Weigel draws comparisons to potentially the church being devastated by lawsuits and bankrupted to Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Solomon's temple in the Old Testament. And I thought that was a really interesting analogy. Oftentimes we fear, what if the church is sued? What if the church loses all her money? Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? God can act in those things, and God might need to act by making a smaller, purer, more bankrupt church. Smaller, purer, and
physically
poorer.
Bankrupt. Physically
yes.
Bankrupt, but morally rich.
Yes, definitely. And so that I think was an interesting comparison to an Old Testament illustration. But what are these 5 truths, Kevin, that the church proposes to modernity?
Right. So the first one is that every human being has inherent dignity and value. And I think that's a good one because you're not going to see that in most arguments, empirical arguments of modernity, right? And he highlighted a couple of things like the will to power. There's no inherent dignity in a human being when you are operating in a Nietzschean framework of will to power.
Right.
It's all about how does the superior individual manage to use and acquire power and then use it to satisfy his or her own personal desires. But this idea, every human being has inherent dignity and value, of course, deriving from the dignity that Christ gives them simply by being a person in his creation and one of his chosen ones. And
another important word there is every human being. So
yes.
This is not simply for the able, but also for the disabled, not simply for the middle-aged and young men and women, but also for the infants and the child in utero and the person at the end of their life who has lost most of their mental faculties.
Right.
Every human being.
The criminal, the murderer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Every human being.
You don't forfeit your dignity.
Your dignity because of what you have done. It's something that's been gifted to you. Second is the reflection on this dignity discloses moral obligations. So I think what Weigel's getting at there, what the church is getting at with that is that the fact that you have dignity obligates you to comport your life in a certain moral manner.
Yes, and the fact that other people have dignity requires that as well.
And
so
this is
because other people have dignity, we can't go rob or kill them.
And this is in contrast in a lot of ways to the modern language of rights. So rights, the concept of rights as they are manifest in modern society are something that grew out of the Enlightenment. And the rights are good. I would say that I think there are certain rights that certainly provide very good things, and the Catholic Church supports especially human rights. But the problem with our modern language of rights is that it oftentimes precludes duty, right? Because it becomes an argument rather than about what is morally good or morally right. It's about what do you have a right to. It's I'm going to do this, or I think free speech is a good example. And a lot of times we come to this argumentation of just because you have the right to say something doesn't make it right to say it.
Right.
And that implies a sort of obligation. So in this way, the church sets itself up in contrast on some level to the modern language of rights and the moral relativism that sometimes comes out of a language of rights, I think.
Yeah, it's a great example because in the free speech paradigm, for example, the whole reason we have free speech is that so people can be empowered to say the good. But that principle of free speech gets corrupted when people say horrible things under the protective banner of free speech. Instead, if we talk about an obligation to speak the good, then we have an entire different paradigm for understanding how we say what we say and when we say it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're absolutely right. The language of duties entails much more about our common understanding of our humanity and the inherent value and dignity of people than does simply a language of rights. And I recommend the work of legal philosopher and Catholic Mary Ann Glendon on this.
Yeah, very good.
She's written a lot on rights versus duties.
So that brings us to number 3, the third truth, which is the human person has a moral nature. So I think we talked about this at some length in our conversation on Veritatis Splendor and what that moral nature as a human being kind of implies. But I don't know. Do you want to talk more about that, or?
Well, I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but we have desires that are not simply met most easily by feeding ourselves and living in nice houses and having nice things. That speaks to the moral aspect of our humanity. We have desires that are not merely carnal. We're not mere animals. We're between beasts and God, as the ethicist Gilbert Meilander says. And so this entails more for our self-understanding and our understanding of each other.
Exactly. So that brings us to number 4, which I think when I read this one, it's going to at first sound pretty obvious, but it forces an examination that I think is difficult at times. And it's the good life is not measured primarily in financial terms.
Yeah. Very good. Very good point.
Right.
Because that flies in the face of
modern economics.
Yeah, exactly.
It flies right in the face of Karl Marx. And, people look, and one of the interesting things about Karl Marx, right, the philosopher of communism, especially in the dialectic, material dialectic, is a lot of people dismiss him as being completely irrelevant to our current state of affairs because, especially capitalism, people look and say, oh, well, capitalism has triumphed, so communism is irrelevant. But Karl Marx said a lot more than just about communism. He was the philosopher who I think best identified the fundamental economic nature of our modern society.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because for a society, especially the Western society that rejects him, we're still so steeped in the idea.
In Marxism, yeah.
We are. I mean, the idea, again, that, how much time do people talk about, the job they have, and immediately you start judging and thinking, well, how much money do they make? Or we talk about keeping up with, your neighbors and
Mm-hmm.
they get a new car. And even though, people will speak of the platitudes of, you're not defined, your worth is not defined by what you have. Or people talk about, I'd rather have, memories than material objects. And I think it really, I can say this certainly for myself, is this very simple statement forces a very serious self-reflection, because even if you truly believe in your heart that your worth is not defined by your material value, our culture and our society is so steeped in that it can be hard to pull yourself away from it, I think. And it's an act, it takes a conscious act of will to truly divorce yourself from that idea.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you mentioned Marx. I would just say, Milton Friedman as well. This is not a simply anti-communist idea. This is really an anti-economic systems of the world idea, which is not to say that the church opposes capitalism by any means, but to say that capitalism is not sufficient. Communism is not sufficient. You cannot design a utopia based on secular economic ideas alone.
Right. And I think, the challenge and a challenge I try to maintain for myself is something like this. When you see a homeless person on the street, is the first thought that crosses your mind, wow, that's the face of Jesus on this street?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it, wow, I'm glad that my life is better and I'm probably better because I have more money than that person?
Yeah, it's the second, I'll be honest.
Yep.
It's the second, or it's, why can't that person
find a way to dig themselves
out? Yeah. I try to stop those thoughts, but that's our first impulse, right?
It is.
That's it. We those of us who have money sit in this position of privilege, and it's very easy for us to buy in, even subconsciously, to that idea that prosperity is measured primarily, if not totally, in economic terms. So that's the fourth truth, that it's not. What's the fifth truth, Kevin?
Yep. So the fifth one kind of builds on that. So it's the idea, as Weigel presents, that culture cannot appeal to our basest instincts. And I'll actually just read kind of his paragraph here. So he says, finally, there is a truth that a culture that appeals to the basis of our instincts, be it high culture or popular culture, damages the human ecology necessary to make political modernity work. For a degraded and debased culture will produce a vulgarized political culture in which base instincts predominate. So I think it's really his way of saying, and the church's way of saying, that any sort of political structure, again, has to be informed by morality, and a truly human morality that is not centered around our carnal desires, but around our spiritual needs. Otherwise, the whole concept of free democracy, political modernity, however you want to term it, is destined to fail, because it will be simply material and cannot actually in any way fulfill our spiritual needs.
One thing I was thinking about as I read these 5 truths is the work of Charlie Camozzi, who we interviewed on Vernacular podcast a few months ago. He is a theologian, moral theologian at Fordham University, but he has talked and written a lot about how we basically recover these truths to create a better society. And he writes in his most recent book about countering throwaway culture through a culture of engagement. Mm-hmm. And I highly recommend the book because he approaches specific policy issues, which Weigel doesn't do, but specific policy issues from the perspective of church teaching and moral theology, and examines how we incorporate these ideas into all aspects of our public life. So I think that's really good. And I just want to sort of recap, because we've talked about a lot of stuff here, and we're almost at 45 minutes. So I want to wrap up and not bust time, since Kevin says I'm extraordinarily long-winded.
Well, and because our readers certainly, they can access this article. So go on First Things. It's on there. If you have already been on First Things a couple times and read some articles, you might hit the paywall because you might have read all your free articles for the month or however long it is. But, if you haven't, then you'll probably put a link in the show notes, right?
Yes, I will, for sure.
Perfect.
Yeah, I highly recommend you read it. If you have hit your paywall, maybe it's time to
pay.
Go ahead and subscribe.
Because you're obviously getting something good out of it.
Get that subscription to First Things. Okay, so let's recap this a little bit, Kevin. The church is in crisis. This is not the first time the church has been in crisis. This is not the worst crisis the church has ever faced, but it is still a crisis indeed. If we're going to understand the makings of this crisis, and we're going to understand how the church will emerge from this crisis, we have to understand the conditions and the process that led to this crisis. To do that, Weigel uses a 5-act framework. He says Act 1 is basically from the French Revolution through the death of Pius IX. This is the penultimate phase of the Counter-Reformation. After that, Leo XIII is elected. He is thought to be an elderly placeholder, but decides instead to go on a tear and start revitalizing Catholic social teaching, Catholic social doctrine, writing a lot about economics, helping the faithful engage with the ideas of the Industrial Revolution. And then in the 20th century, we get World War I and World War II, and the church, weathers that, but a lot of her faithful are killed. She is in the world at a time when 6 million Jews are killed in the Holocaust. This is a very, very difficult time to be alive, I think, to be a human being. This is a very difficult thing. John the 23rd inaugurates Act 3 with the Second Vatican Council. This sort of re-energizes the church's missionary zeal, and he says, we're going to go and engage modernity fully so that we can convert modernity. His opening address was called "The Joy Mother Church Rejoices." Mm-hmm. And his idea was, we have this, pearl of great price. We're going to go share it with the world. Unfortunately, as wonderful as Vatican II was, the post-conciliar, that is the post-council era of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and really just the super modernity saturated era, interpreted those documents, and many people in the church interpreted those documents in the wrong light. And that led to a sort of, not a retrenchment with modernity, but an accommodation of modernity. So the church accommodates modernity too much. There's intellectual duplicity among the faithful, both lay and clerics. And this leads, this directly produces the conditions that lead to our current crisis of fidelity, where, cardinals, prelates, bishops, clerics are disbelieving church teaching, publicly proclaiming things against church teaching, sexually abusing young people and children. This is the crisis of fidelity that's gotten us to here. And so the sort of corrective was under Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict, and they tried to remind the faithful of the truths of the church, even despite this, or even in the midst of this engagement. And now we're in Act 5, and this is perhaps the ultimate act in this engagement with modernity, but Weigel's arguing that the church's mission now is to incorporate those 5 truths and to remind modernity and modern people what the human being is all about and how we can best conceptualize and think of and encounter and engage the human being to set our project of modernity on firmer foundations for the future. Did I capture that well, Kevin?
I think that's a great summary.
Thank you so much for listening to Creedal Catholic. We'll be back again soon with another topic. If you have suggestions for topics, things you want us to talk about, please do reach out, creedalcatholic@vernacularpodcast.com. We were just talking last night. We have some exciting guests coming on, and we're developing a potential guest list of some people to ask about coming on Creedal Catholic. So if you have an idea for one of those persons, perhaps we could also reach out to them and get them on the show. So creedalcatholic@vernacularpodcast.com. You can also find us at VernacularPod, at, is it KM Boscheman?
KM Boscheman.
At KM Boscheman on Twitter, and Facebook.com/vernacularpodcast, or Instagram @vernacularpod. All right. For Creedal Catholic, I'm Zach.
I'm Kevin. Peace.
God bless you.